the cook, looking monstrously fat in those wonderful descriptions of his flesh quivering. Fuchsia and Steerpike again from a draft, I assume, with text and illustrations. I believe the original text of Peake's manuscript is a thing to behold. It's profusely illustrated throughout. And then to complement those, I found an epic study of Gormenghast Castle by our old friend Alan Lee. So that ties together what we've been doing all week, as we've seen some examples of Lee's illustrations for both Tolkien and T.H. White. It's nice to end with his vision of Gormenghast as well. Alan Lee, of course, now an accomplished illustrator of fantasy fiction in particular, very much a specialist in those texts. Nonetheless, one can imagine it being quite daunting following Peake's own example, since the author is in this case the most accomplished illustrator of his own work that there could be. I had forgotten, of course, that Tolkien also produced illustrations for some of his work, which are interesting. Tolkien certainly wasn't a professional visual artist and doesn't exhibit anything like the same degree of proficiency in drawing or painting as you would expect of Peake, but his illustrations for The Hobbit certainly have a charm of their own, and I think there's a collection called Pictures by J.R.R. Tolkien as well. They do have a distinctive quality of their own. There are sort of odd discrepancies of perspective. I mean, there's a famous picture of Bilbo and the dragon Smaug in his lair, which often features on covers of The Hobbit, where the perspective is clearly dead wrong. Bilbo is far too large in relation to the dragon. I mean, he's clearly much smaller than the dragon, but he's not thoroughly dwarfed by him as you would expect. And also he's wearing the ring, so you shouldn't be able to see him at all, and Tolkien has sort of crudely indicated this by sort of cartoonish little sort of star shape around him, as code for the fact that he can't really be seen, but this is a clue as to where he actually is. So clearly, Tolkien's own illustrations, fun as they are, didn't put off many accomplished artists following him. But Peake is a very hard act to follow. Nonetheless, I'm really glad to see that Lee has tried his hand at it, because I mean he brings his own strengths of this kind of romantic realism that is so well suited to these texts. This is an enormous painting, as far as I can see. I mean, the scale here doesn't do it justice, but if you simply search Alan Lee Gormenghast, it takes you straight to this image, and you can open it up. It's far too big to fit on the screen, but then you can spend hours just sort of moving across the canvas and finding detail after detail in it. What I like about it is that it captures the immensity of the castle so well, and of course that is an important feature of the story that I'll be saying a bit about today. And in the way that the novels themselves almost overwhelm characters in the setting. As striking as many of the characters are, you have the sense that they are all of them singularly and collectively dwarfed by Gormenghast itself, which I think for more than one reader has suggested being a character in itself, perhaps the dominant character, as it is clearly the dominant setting. So it's thoroughly appropriate that we have a perspective of just part of this castle, indicating its immensity stretching out in all directions, and just a hint of the landscape it looks out over. But also, if you look carefully, you can spot characters hidden in among the scenery. Perhaps easiest to spot are just a few of the Countess's multitudinous white cats that follow her around. In one wonderful description, I think they're likened to a river of milk. Depending where you're seated, you might not be able to see all of these, but as I said, very easy to find and then study at your own pace. There's another one further off. Here in the foreground near the bottom, you can just make out Barquentine with his crutch, scuttling around the corridors as he does. 3 diminutive figures here. This must be Fuchsia in the red dress. I'm guessing this is the dwarfish nanny Slag. I haven't quite worked out who that might be. If you can think of a possibility, let me know. I wondered if it might be Steerpike, but then I spotted, no, here he is, lurking. You can just make out his pale face, that he's sort of spying on the others, I think. It must have taken, I can't imagine how long, but it's a great piece to enjoy, I think. All right, moving on. I first designed this course for Rhodes undergraduates probably about a decade ago now, and at that time I had yet to read Mervyn Peake, whereas the Tolkien, Lewis and White texts I'd known for much longer, in most cases from as far back as my teens already. But I already knew that I wanted to teach those 3, and I felt that a 4th was needed just to round things off and give the course the kind of weight that was suitable for 3rd-year students. And despite not knowing his work at the time, it was already immediately obvious to me that Peake had to be the other author I needed, and I knew this because his reputation had preceded him for some time. It intrigued me for many years, and I also knew that he fitted in with the historical context of the other 3, which we talked about in the introduction. I had actually tried to read Peake much earlier, but I think I was too young, and I think I failed for reasons that have a meaningful bearing on our approach to him today. Because while I feel that Tolkien, White and Lewis are all masterful stylists in their different ways, their styles are never intrusive. They're always used in the service of other narrative purposes, which is most of the time just good, plain, old-fashioned storytelling. Right? In that sense, their writing is transparent. Right. I think this even applies, though it might seem to contradict what I was saying about T.H. White yesterday. He is not always transparent because he gets in the way of what he's telling you all the time, but it is at least very clear that he's doing that, and you soon get used to the game that is being played. So all 3 are relatively easy reads, even The Lord of the Rings, although if you do come to it very young as a child reader of The Hobbit, it tends to take maybe 2 or 3 attempts before you really get into your stride, because of course a lot of young readers, they expect the same narrative pace as you find in The Hobbit, and of course the Lord of the Rings is decidedly leisurely. by comparison. Right? But that is an obstacle usually overcome within a year or two. That was certainly the case with me. So I think this style is an important contributory factor in those authors' accessibility to a fairly wide readership still. But even in Tolkien's case, where the pace is leisurely, the text itself unfolds with clarity, with purposefulness that tends to take the reader by the hand, sustain the attention easily. All right. And then White's light-heartedness, chirpiness, Lewis's directness, quick pace, if anything, make those two even easier to read. But reading Peake is a very different experience. Right? He immediately makes a strong impression, but it's not an easy one, and I think it can prove to be an acquired taste. Right? And this is perhaps borne out by the fact that while the critics, critics hailed him almost from the first publication of Titus Groan, he has not enjoyed the same mass readership as many of the others. I did find in my case that I liked this style immediately, but I still found it difficult at that age. I think I lacked the discipline to push on with it. All right. In direct contrast to the other three, Peake's style draws attention to itself. You have the sense that the sentences are very carefully crafted, almost every word and the placing of the word chosen for just the right effect. And so you have a sense that they're crafted not just for what they're saying, but for the way that they're saying it. In that sense, his prose feels self-consciously literary in a way that the styles of the others don't. Where they are all modern, in the sense we defined in Monday's lecture, Peake is something else. He's modernist. Both the experimental quality of much of his writing and also his ironic temperament make him very much the counterpart of Joyce and Kafka, as I've said before. I think when we're reading the Gormenghast novels, our sense is that the story not only unfolds slowly, as Tolkien's also does, but in this case it unfolds obscurely, and that's deliberate. It takes us a long while before we know exactly what's going on, if we ever do. All right. In Anthony Burgess's very useful introduction to the first edition of Titus Groan, he talks about this sort of disorienting effect. He says the text is full of red herrings, meant to lead you in conflicting directions. It takes work, but it's very enjoyable once you acquire the right patience for it. One of the causes of this obscurity I'm talking about can also be seen from a contrast with Tolkien. We don't have any conspectus to compare with Gandalf's long meeting with Frodo in The Shadow of the Past, where early on we set out the terms in which the rest of the narrative, no matter how sprawling it becomes, is framed. You'll remember I talked about how Tolkien took years and years because the middle of the story grew under his hands, but he had the beginning and the end figured out right from the start. We don't have anything like that in Gormenghast. In its place, we have a series of vignettes at first. And that pictorial or painterly quality that I was talking about in his writing, not just the illustrations that he adds, it contributes to this. It gives you a sense of very sharply focused close-ups on this variety of curious figures, usually grotesques, and their exact relationship to one another or to their environment isn't always clearly apparent either. Before long, there are certainly happenings and even adventures of a kind, but the emphasis always falls somewhere else, usually the setting and this atmosphere that it exudes. Right? And even on the rhythms and the phrasing of the language itself, the tone, the diction, the figures, a kind of musicality. It's very interesting that Peake's right is both painterly in the way that we talked about and perhaps musical as well. Certainly there are many passages of a marked I think lyricism is an apt word, if not quite ideal, because, yes, the lyric suggests something softer than we have in the case of Peake. But, Well, where does this leave us in terms of that question we keep asking? You know, what type of a fantasy is Gormenghast? How does it relate the real and the unreal? We've seen in all three of the other cases this has proved more difficult than it at first appears. But I suggested right from the outset on Monday that Gormenghast is surely liminal fantasy. It's in this borderline space. Some things about the text suggest that it must be another world, a parallel universe of some kind. Other details are surprisingly part and parcel of our own world, all right? The religious references, you know? The very foul-mouthed figure of Barquentine is always swearing with reference to Satan. There's the finger of the tower at the beginning pointing blasphemously up at heaven. Fuchsia's attic, I think, is described as a kind of pagan chapel. So what do those sort of religious undertones have reference to, if nothing in our world? But there is nothing like Gormenghast in our world. Well, there are things that point towards it, but it's so exaggerated. It is very difficult to know where we are. Now, one thing we can be sure of, it's clearly neither of those linked types, the portal or intrusive fantasy. We are always in the same place, wherever it is. It might, I suppose, be a kind of immersive fantasy, and it certainly feels immersive. You are so immersed in the world of this text that you feel trapped in it, as the characters seem to us to be trapped. It has a uniquely claustrophobic atmosphere. You know? But this also isn't the type of world that we normally expect of fantasy fiction. All right? I did make the point on Tuesday that Middle-earth isn't another world either, but that argument depended on disproving the widespread assumption that it is. But in this case, we can't make any assumptions. None of the usual supernatural apparatus of the magician and the dragon and the quest motif occurs in this text. I suppose we have ghosts, but ghosts we can get away with, even in some otherwise realistic fiction, because there's a certain ambiguity about whether they're really there or not. You know? But if nothing is actually otherworldly in these novels, everything is weird. Yes. Setting, characters, language, dialogue, it's all weird. It all has this quality of an underlying unease. You feel as if sometimes you're in a nightmare that you can't wake up from. You might remember the essay question I shared with you in the introduction. Yeah? In Gormenghast, weirdness is a stylistic and thematic virtue. Discuss. Yeah? Surprised none of you picked up on my telling you that was the second favourite of the exam questions I've ever said. I thought somebody might say, well, what's your favourite then? Yeah? Yeah? It was on Tristram Shandy, which I mentioned yesterday as an important influence on T.H. White and that romantic irony of style. Yeah? The rubric was very straightforward and traditional. It's been used in countless questions by examiners across the world, which is place the following passage in context and analyze the passage and say something about the role that it performs in the text as a whole. Very, very standard type of essay question. But the passage that I'd set is the notorious page in Tristram Shandy, which is filled with black ink, so that it's just a giant block. So if they hadn't actually paid attention to what was going on, they were well and truly flummoxed. I'm not sure, as in the case of T.H. White, exactly what relationship can be traced between Lawrence Sterne and Mervyn Peake, but in their different ways they certainly stand out as two of the great eccentrics of literature. In turning back to the mystery of this castle and where it is, I've come across some speculation that Peake was influenced by his memories of growing up in China, which we talked about in the introduction. This opening description, for example, of the outer dwellers on the fringes of the castle, these poor villagers who aren't allowed in, but they sort of exist in this parasitical way on the fringes of the castle, outside these great impenetrable gates, corresponds to experiences that he had in China. And another suggestion one often comes across is that this labyrinthine ceremonial ritual that is pushed to such absurd lengths in the daily life of the castle is a sort of satirical version of ancient Chinese rituals that he'd observed early in life. And doubtless there's some truth in that, but can only go so far. I don't detect anything obviously Oriental in the story. The castle setting feels recognisably redolent of the European Middle Ages. And it is also subtly anachronistic as well. We saw yesterday how T.H. White is overtly anachronistic. But you have this apparently medieval setting, but you also have quite relatively modern seeming characters. I mean, Dr. Prunesqualler, for example, has been to quite an up-to-date medical academy. I think he's able to do all sorts of complicated operations. The professors in the second book, like something we could expect at any number of English universities or public schools, and the schoolboys certainly. So there's a mixture of times and places going on here, I think. The routine label that is replied to every cover blurb of every edition of Gormenghast that you will find is, of course, Gothic, all right? And for all sorts of obvious reasons. But it's something more than just Gothic, because there's anachronism here as well. The Gothic is a literary genre already developed over 2 centuries before Mervyn Peake comes along, and he takes it to another plane altogether. Gormenghast Castle isn't just your typical Gothic castle. It seems almost the Platonic form of Gothic castles, the archetype on which all others must ultimately be based, even if they precede it. It pushes things to the furthest possible bounds. It's rambling, ruinous, decayed, labyrinthine, oppressive, but on a scale to dwarf all rivals. Right? And this is related, I think, to the near total domination of the text that I've already referred to. Right? Those outer dwellers that we meet at the beginning are both socially marginalised, by the inhabitants of the castle itself, but also textually. Right? There's very little, certainly before the 3rd volume, Titus Alone, that takes place outside the castle walls. There are only occasional forays beyond, and it's the sort of obsessive setting of Gormenghast itself that takes centre stage and almost doesn't let you out, as it doesn't let the characters out. I wonder if the role of the outer dwellers isn't ultimately to give young Titus himself some sense of the outside. You'll remember that his he's brought up by Nanny Slag, isn't he? But she's no longer producing milk, so they get a young woman from the outside to suckle Titus, remember? And that external influence, I think it's subtly suggested, is what sort of leads to his eventual wanderlust. He, of course, is the titular character, becomes the focus for our desire to be free of this stifling place. But even in the 3rd volume, where he does escape, you have this sense that Gormenghast is still in his mind or following him, sort of looming just behind his shoulder somewhere. It's this inescapable presence. But certainly in the first 2 volumes, we are really stuck in there. There's also very little suggested in those first 2 as to what Gormenghast's context is, or of anything much in the world outside. We know that this is the home of the Earls of Groan, but we know nothing else about their earldom. And this is again clearly the opposite of the sort of paradigmatic fantasy represented above all by Tolkien's Middle-earth, where we have a vast landscape, and the whole purpose of the story is to explore it, from forest to mountain to river and marshland and everything else in between. Here we have the polar opposite of that. We're always, it seems, in the same place. And although it's just one building, at the same time, it's such a large building, it almost seems like a city in its own right. You have this impression all the time of endless corridors, stairways, rooms, courtyards. What's also important is the effect of asymmetry that you have. That in its extreme age, it seems to have been put together over several different periods and conflicting styles of architecture, so that it's disordered in its design. One hesitates even to use the word design, perhaps, although, of course, that's true in another sense of, on Peake's part, it's designed to seem that way. The different individual settings for scenes, the kitchens, the library, various apartments, we have a sense of each one, but they're sprawling. We don't quite know where they are in relation to one another. The doctor's house seems to be in a sort of quiet part of the castle all on its own. I think it has its own street. The twin aunts, Cora and Clarice, have this fantastic apartment with that tree growing horizontally out of the wall. Great feat of imagination in itself. One of my favourite descriptions of setting that you encounter quite early on is Fuchsia's wonderful suite of rooms. You remember she has this bedroom where she's drawn charcoal drawings all over the walls, and the secret entrance to her inner sanctum is behind the bed, and it can only be accessed by moving the bed out of the way, and she always sort of pulls it to after her so that nobody else can have access to what lies beyond. And then you're sort of led through this series of attic rooms which have their own irregular steps, and there are two parts at right angles to each other, and it's full of lumber and clutter over the centuries. Wonderful assortment of oddities, and then you have the balcony that it leads to, where Steerpike later unexpectedly surprises her, much to her displeasure. But that's a wonderful example of how this setting works, that you don't know how it holds together exactly. We always only see part of this castle. We know there's always more unseen, and that remains the case throughout. So it must be on a completely sprawling scale. All right. Again, I think another contrast with Tolkien is important here. There's no map. All right. We have to have a map of Middle-earth to get our bearings. All right. It's very important that we don't have a map of Gormenghast. My more cynical side strongly suspects that somebody somewhere has had a go and tried to produce a map of Gormenghast, but that would be wrong. It wouldn't just be doomed to failure. It's missing the whole point of the text, that we're meant to experience disorientation. You know? It's part of the weirdness. We're supposed to be lost in this place. And I think the whole point of Steerpike's plot hinges on all the other characters' ignorance of the castle. But even though he's exceptional in sort of spying out the byways of the castle and using them to his advantage, even he never seems to acquire total knowledge of every part of the castle. All right. The reader certainly doesn't. And that is important, I think. We feel bewildered. Right. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit because I've already said that. One thing we haven't had much time for this week, and I want to make an exception in the case of Gormenghast, is just a little close reading. It's been very hard because we've done, as I warned you at the outset, an overview of 4 immense texts in their own right. But because of this distinctiveness of Peake's style, that I want to say a couple of things about that. We need look no further than the opening, where it's immediately apparent. You know? And you have to imagine that the text invites you to imagine the likes of, I suppose, Christopher Lee, who of course is in the BBC adaptation of Gormenghast. He plays Mr. Flay. But you'll have to make do with me instead, all right? I can't give you the same sort of resonance, but you can imagine it, yes. Gormenghast, that is the main massing of the original stone, taken by itself, would have displayed a certain ponderous architectural quality, were it possible to have ignored the circumfusion of those mean dwellings that swarmed like an epidemic around its outer walls. Right? Isn't this wonderful stuff? Right? But at the same time, you can see how I found that difficult as a teenager. But it's absorbing now. But this is what I mean by language that immediately draws attention to itself, and the phrasing, the certain ponderous architectural quality. I mean, what is the technical term for that? I've forgotten. It's doing exactly what it talks about. The term certain ponderous architectural quality has a certain ponderous architectural quality. Yeah? But this is introducing you to setting an atmosphere all at once. But his fondness for choosing a word there like swarmed, right? Just because it has a long vowel, it's emphasized by the rhythm of the sentence, but it also suggests something at least faintly unpleasant. And we find this continues. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbour, until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels lay hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like limpets to a rock. Again, an image of the parasitical almost, but also just the faint archaism of using a word like thereto. Right. And skip a little bit, but of course it builds up there that wonderful image I referred to, the tower patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fists of knuckled masonry and pointed blasphemously at heaven. At night, the owls made of it an echoing throat. By day, it stood voiceless and cast its long shadow. It's wonderful that the tower becomes both a mutilated finger and a throat. All right, two grotesque bodily images there. And of course it's not on its own, it's part of the fists of knuckled masonry. All right. Fantastic effect, and it goes on for page after page, drawing you in. It is one of the things that I suggested makes one think of Dickens. All right? What it shares with Dickens is a quality of forcing you to read slowly. You can't rush your way through this stuff. Yeah. And I've already suggested in the introduction that the grotesque caricaturish nature of the characters is something in common with Dickens, but the names really draw your attention to Peake's fondness for Dickens, except in his case perhaps with an added undertone of violence or the macabre. So Flay, Swelter, Sour Dust, Steerpike, Sepulchrave, Prune Squalor, again, probably my favourite. But you can hear there's a kindred resemblance to the likes of Ebenezer Scrooge, or Mr. Gradgrind, or Dombey and Son, or Martin Chuzzlewit, or Wackford Squeers, Mr. Micawber, Uriah Heep. Right? Exaggerated names. Steerpike even seems to be a direct echo of Steerforth in not Great Expectations, David Copperfield. And they both also turn out to be scoundrels. So I don't know what the connection is exactly, but it sounds like potential for an academic paper. And you often have the sense, because these names proliferate, they're even given to very minor characters, that Peake is having great fun making them up as he goes along. They occur in clusters sometimes. Three of the professors in the second volume are Spiregrain, Throd and Splint, who somehow sound as if they should go into business together, presumably as coffin makers. All right, so quite a lot of Dickens here. There's Lewis Carroll also, I think. I told you that Peake is almost as well known as an illustrator of the Alice books as he was of his own. And that quality of the nightmarish, the surreal, they have in common. I think also a nonsensical quality that often emerges in conversation. A lot of the conversations appear to proceed in non sequiturs. Are these people really talking to each other, or are they just talking for their own amusement? Dr. Prunesquall is a good example of this. His hyena-like laugh is always sort of directed at his own eloquence. I was putting this together and I wondered if there isn't something of the Shakespearean here as well. There are a lot of echoes of Hamlet, I think. It's as if it's Elsinore but on steroids. I mean, both heroes' mothers are called Gertrude. Father here ends up mad and later a ghost. Fuchsia has a tragic resemblance to Ophelia. There seems to be something in the background there. The progress of the plot is not non-existent, but it is really slow and perhaps not the most, not Peake's priority. One of the ironies of the first novel, which is called Titus Grown, is that Titus himself is hardly a character in it, in that he remains an infant throughout. He begins to rise to prominence in the second volume. But as I said, this is only a trilogy by default. We don't know how many volumes Peake might have gone on to write, and what the further life of Titus might have been. But he emerges very slowly as a protagonist. Perhaps this is partly an accident of the unfinished nature of the whole project, but I suppose it's the villain, it's Steerpike, who is most compelling for many readers. I mean, that was certainly my experience. It wears off a bit, I think, in the second volume. There's some speculation about whether the quality of the narrative decreases as Peake increasingly struggles with the rigours of Parkinson's. Certainly the third volume, Titus Alone, feels very strange and disjointed, but again that is part of the effect of the book. It's a case of the fine line between genius and insanity. But for me, and I think certainly for some readers, Anthony Burgess in his introduction betrays this prejudice as well. The first volume is the one that makes the strongest impression, the one that maybe stays with you for longest. And in that, well, one has a strange attraction for Steerpike, I think, before he becomes as completely psychotic as he does in the second volume. But it's partly because, well, our hero, as I say, is just a baby, and none of the other characters are particularly likable. They're all peculiar, and the whole place is peculiar, and Steerpike Steerpike does win some kind of admiration from us, I think, by the agency that he demonstrates alone among everybody. And he is, of course, the focalizer of much of the story. So we go with him on this journey across the rooftops. And he first demonstrates his cleverness, of course, when he's imprisoned in the tower room from which there is no escape, it seems. But with great nerve, he turns out to have climbed up through the window and made his way over the roofs, and then we go with him on this journey. And that's one of the first scenes in which we get the impression of this place that just goes on and on and on, as he spends some days, I think, wandering over the roofs of the castle and looking down and sort of beginning to become, as much as anyone is, the master of this domain. All right. I don't want to go on and on into question time as I periodically do, so I'm going to wrap it up about now. I hope I've partly fulfilled the promise I made at the beginning of giving you some sense of the tantalizing further reading that you can go on to in all four of these cases. All right. I don't think you could find four more disparate writers in a way, and yet they are all united in producing out of one of the darkest chapters in history some of the most vivid feats of imagination in our literature, and if nothing else, that should give us all hope. Well, there we are. Yeah. Thanks very much. We would all appreciate it if you were to take some time to give feedback in your evaluations. We can learn a lot from that about what you like, what you prefer, what you'd like more of, less of, none of at all. Let us know. I have all sorts of ideas that I'd like to try out if you're interested. So I'm interested in responding to suggestions as well. There is still time for questions, and at this final stage, of course, you can ask me anything pertaining to the discussion that has ranged across such wide territory this week. So, last chance.
Do you know something a bit about Titus and No? Old Gorgon Garden. And I hated it.
You hated Titus Alone? Yeah. Is it because you're not in the castle anymore?
Possibly, but the stamina was so different. It was like a stranger country.
Yes.
There's also an editing problem. The first edition of Titus Alone was very badly edited, and it was then subsequently edited by Langdon Jones, the new wave science fiction writer.
Okay.
So you might have got the wrong, it depends when you read it.
I imagine at that stage his handwriting was terribly bad to read.
It was all to do with the publisher copying it together from notes. It wasn't together in the final draft.
But he was already very, very ill by the time he was working on Titus Alone, I gather, from what I've read. Yeah.
Compared to the second edition, is a lot more coherent.
I must look into this further. Yeah, the impression one has of reading it is, I think, very different from the first two. I probably share some of your bias, as you've noticed. I spoken primarily about the first two novels. One reason for that, of course, is there's only so much you can cover in one session. If you insist on locating just one, allocating just one for each of these giants. So good. There were other hands going up earlier. Who's first? Right?
Just a comment. Looking at the pictures, and I don't know if that's how Mervyn Peake draws anyway, but he seems to have the same eyes in fuchsia and. Yes.
That's Deer Pike next to her.
I
Yes.
don't know if he feels a relationship with them.
Well, they have a relationship.
I've only got 3.
I'm not giving much away. Yeah. Oh, it. Yes, yes. The question is if the figure I failed to identify earlier could perhaps be Mr. Flay. That's right. You always know when he's coming because of the cracking of his bony knees. Yes, just as you always know when Barkentine is coming because of the sound of the crutch. So that is a possibility. Yeah? If this is before he's banished. Good. It's an intriguing mystery to try and solve, though. Who's who in the picture? I'm sorry, there was another question earlier. Don't let me.
Related to Gorman Goss, he said he had some other ideas he'd like to try out.
Mm.
Tell us what some of them are.
All right, but let me hold that for a moment. Yes.
I was wanting to just make a comment that all the portraits show the characters looking sideways. Not one of them is looking straight at the viewer, and it suggests a sort of twisted and devious
Oh yes, yes.
nature. Quite unnerving.
Well, Irma is presenting us with her profile quite proudly, but she seems to be just glancing out of the corner of her eye as well. I think that's certainly part of the effect. I have ideas all the time, but there's another question. Yeah.
Do you think the sort of darkness of the history, I mean, the two wars, was one of the reasons why they wrote fantasy?
I briefly mentioned, I think, Tom Shippey's attitude to this on Monday. He certainly argues that is the case, and he argues very persuasively, so that I find myself agreeing with him. And he talks about how, well, he makes the claim fantasy is, well, the fantastic broadly is the dominant mode of 20th century literature. So he looks beyond what we think of as fantasy per se. He talks about Kafka, he talks about George Orwell, Kurt Vonnegut. He gives numerous examples of writers who were themselves often traumatized by war in one way or another and turned to write in the fantastic mode. And it's an argument I can't really do justice to here, but one simple thing one can see going on is that you don't present an atrocity as it appears directly, but you're able to use allusion and symbol and suggestion to get at it in a more interesting, ultimately more effective way. I don't know. You should look up Tom Shippey on. Well, he writes primarily on Tolkien, but it's applicable. This is in his Tolkien apology, author of the century.
So do you think Mervyn Peake had a sort of message? Sorry. I mean, did he have a sort of message? I mean, he wasn't trying to convey the same sort of idea that Tolkien was trying to present, a sort of noble moral tale.
Mm-hmm.
Good and evil. You don't get the same feeling with Mervyn Peake. He was wandering around inside his head. It was
Yes.
rather sort of fractured and just
Mm.
disjointed and disturbing.
Yes, that but he's giving you a sense of the unease both within himself and the world around him, I think. But you have another answer from my colleague, I think.
Well, Peake was writing fantasy from when he was about 8.
Gosh, that's amazing.
Drawing, he was reading a guy, at one point he was living on the island of Sark, Channel Islands, and he captured he climbed down the precipitous cliff to capture a cormorant, which kept in his studio for a while. That's the sort of guy he was.
A live cormorant.
But this was
Yeah.
written during he had a nervous breakdown and started writing this. And one critic has pointed out that you can compare Peake and Kafka in that Joseph K. is always trying to find his way to the castle, but he can never make it. So
Yes.
he's outside the castle. Whereas the old Titus is trying to make his way outside of the castle. And then I think with Titus alone, it's almost like a Salvador Dali landscape where suddenly he discovers the reality of the outside world is perhaps more bizarre and frightening than what he's escaped.
Yes, no, that is an interesting irony in Titus alone, that you encounter this escape from a nightmare and you think, well,
How old is he when he gets out?
he seems to be about 20 at the most, yeah. So it has the quality of a Bildungsroman, you know, this the romantic hero going forth to encounter experience. But yes, what he finds outside is as strange in its way as where he came from. We still have maybe 5 minutes.
Is there a movie treatment you'd recommend?
Well, the only one I know of is the BBC. When was that? That's about 10 years at least.
Yeah.
Was that a single movie or a series?
I think it's a 4-part series, and it only covers the first 2 books. So Titus alone doesn't feature in it. So you'd like that, yeah? Yes, and I mentioned it earlier. That Christopher Lee plays Mr. Flay. The inescapable and ubiquitous Stephen Fry is Professor Belgrove. Who is Steerpike? Oh, yes, Rhys Meyers, is it? Yeah?
I think he's bad casting.
He looks the part. Yeah, perhaps not quite creepy enough. But that's the only version that I'm aware of. I think there were adaptations for radio earlier that I've read about.
After Narnia and Lord of the Rings, it seems to be crying out for a blockbuster.
Oh, I don't know if it would do it justice. Yeah.
You need a Fellini to do a 12-hour.
Yeah, I would pay good money to see that. Yeah.
A sudden thought. How does science fiction fit into fantasy?
Well, we had a bit of a talk about that earlier in the week, didn't we? That it's a vexed question because science fiction is often thought of as being a bit more speculative about what might be possible in the future, whereas fantasy is backward looking and inhabits the past. But I suggested when we looked at Lewis that this is more of a sort of hybrid of the two, and sometimes the term science fantasy is used there because you have some of the apparatus of science fiction, but in fact it's far more redolent of the medieval sources than any sort of real speculation about scientific possibilities in the future.
Neil Gaiman has been talking to people about doing broadcast movie.
Oh, really?
That would be quite special, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So it might still happen. Yeah. But talk is